The modern mechanized superpower is an illusion of invulnerability. For decades, the global order assumed that a nation sitting atop the planet's largest energy reserves could never be starved of its own lifeblood. That assumption has just been incinerated. Deep within the sovereign borders of the Russian Federation, an unprecedented inferno is consuming the very infrastructure that sustains its war machine. This is not a series of lucky tactical strikes. It is a systemic, terminal dismantling of a petro-state's core architecture. Vital energy assets, the beating heart of Moscow's military logistics, are being burned to the ground by relentless, autonomous swarms. The adversary is a nation without a traditional deep strike air force, yet it has unleashed an enormous firestorm that the Kremlin's sprawling defense grid is structurally incapable of extinguishing. The arteries are severed. The collapse has begun. On the night of April 18th, a swarm of unmanned systems breached Russian airspace with absolute impunity. Their designated targets were not frontline military garrisons or troop concentrations, but rather the sprawling, highly volatile oil infrastructure that has financially sustained the occupation of Ukraine. The illusion of a safe Russian interior shattered instantly. In the Samara region, located deep within the country's sovereign borders, the Syzran and Novokuybishevsk refineries were systematically ignited. Simultaneously, thousands of miles to the west in Leningrad, explosive payloads struck the RPK Vysotsk Lukoil 2 oil terminal. This specific facility serves as an essential arterial node for exporting Russian crude via the Baltic Sea. To the south, the Krasnodar region witnessed the catastrophic failure of its local air defense networks as the Tikhoretsk oil pumping station suffered a direct, paralyzing hit. The Ministry of Defense later claimed their defense grids neutralized 258 inbound drones that night. If that figure is accurate, it only underscores the terrifying volume of the threat. The sheer density of the autonomous offensive overran the defensive architecture. The General Staff in Kiev immediately released visual evidence confirming the strikes. Every image displayed the exact same terminal result: thick columns of black smoke rising from shattered energy complexes. Days later, the geometric scale of this asymmetric campaign expanded even further. On April 20th, the Tuapse oil port, a vital logistical hub on the Black Sea, capable of processing 240,000 barrels of crude daily, was severely damaged. This marked the second successful strike on that specific port in under a week, igniting fresh blazes mere hours after the previous inferno was finally contained. Let us examine the raw geography of this collapse. The distance from the Baltic Sea ports of Primorsk and Ust-Luga, which collectively handle 42% of the nation's seaborne oil exports, down to the Black Sea basin, represents a continental expanse. Earlier in March, those northern facilities were engulfed, forcing authorities to shut down port operations entirely as storage tanks burned uncontrollably. The Kremlin relies heavily on the illusion of vast geographic depth to protect its strategic assets. The brutal reality is that sheer size has now become its ultimate liability. When a nation's energy network stretches across 11 time zones, defending every critical node against low-cost, deep-strike weapons is a mathematical impossibility. These drones are traveling hundreds, and sometimes well over 1,000 miles to execute their programming. In March alone, an overwhelming 7,347 drones crossed into Russian airspace. While defense officials boast of mass interceptions, the continuous destruction of refineries proves the overarching defense grid has fundamentally failed. Moscow is attempting to police a continental perimeter against an adversary that builds deep-strike weapons at a relentless volume. The defensive calculus has fractured permanently, and as the physical geography of Russia burns, a far more devastating financial hemorrhage is quietly accelerating beneath the smoke. To understand the true gravity of these deep-strike operations, one must separate the illusion of crude oil from the brutal reality of refined fuel. Russia is undeniably a massive petro-state, but simply pumping black crude out of the Siberian permafrost does not propel a mechanized infantry division across a contested battlefield. Raw petroleum is functionally useless until it is superheated, cracked, and distilled into high-octane aviation fuel, diesel, and military-grade lubricants. When Ukrainian forces detonate an explosive payload inside a refining tower, they are not merely destroying a physical commodity. They are surgically amputating Russia's ability to convert raw subterranean wealth into kinetic military power. The shattered infrastructure at Tuapse, which possessed the vital capability to process up to 240,000 barrels of crude daily, represents an irreplaceable loss. These are multi-billion-dollar industrial labyrinths, historically reliant on advanced Western technology that is now heavily sanctioned and virtually impossible to procure. Rebuilding them is a geopolitical fantasy. The mathematics of this systemic failure are staggering. By directly obliterating both refining nodes and export terminals, Kyiv has forcibly throttled Russian oil shipments by approximately 880,000 barrels per day. This is not a temporary fluctuation in market supply. It is a permanent, structural amputation. Every time the sun sets over the smoldering ruins of these sovereign facilities, a devastating $100 million is snatched directly out of the Russian war chest. In the month of March alone, this relentless drone campaign inflicted at least $2.3 billion in catastrophic financial losses upon the Russian energy sector. If this operational tempo is maintained, the aggregate economic devastation is projected to rob the Kremlin of $27.6 billion by the end of 2026. This physical destruction triggers an irreversible chain reaction down the entire length of the state's supply chain. When an export terminal burns, the raw oil intended to flow through it does not simply vanish. It backs up. The pipeline network clogs. Storage tanks fill to maximum capacity. Eventually, the drilling sites themselves must be capped. A desperate, emergency maneuver in freezing Siberian environments that can permanently destroy the geological pressure of the oil reservoir itself. Furthermore, a terminal reduction in refining capacity means gasoline and diesel begin to vanish from domestic Russian pumps. The Kremlin is trapped in a suffocating double bind. They are bleeding the physical fuel required to mount ground assaults, while simultaneously hemorrhaging the hard currency required to keep their isolated economy afloat. The petro-state is slowly suffocating on its own trapped resources. Yet, the most profound strategic humiliation for Moscow is not just the immediate financial ruin. It is the terrifying realization that this entire geo-economic collapse was engineered by Kyiv to ruthlessly exploit and ultimately override the hesitant foreign policy of its most powerful allies. As the smoke plumes blacken the skies over sovereign Russian territory, a profound administrative panic is quietly fracturing the Kremlin's internal command structure. Regional governors, once isolated from the brutal realities of the frontline, are suddenly staring at the ashes of their local economies. Officials across targeted districts, most notably in the Leningrad region, are desperately petitioning Moscow for immediate military intervention, demanding the deployment of dedicated surface-to-air missile batteries to shield their surviving industrial assets. It is a completely rational, logical plea for survival. Yet, it exposes the most fatal vulnerability of the modern Russian military apparatus, the total exhaustion of its defensive inventory. The Kremlin cannot fulfill these desperate requests because the physical hardware simply no longer exists. Since the onset of this catastrophic invasion, the Russian armed forces have suffered an unprecedented attrition rate in specialized defensive technology. Financial intelligence data confirms that an astonishing 1,350 individual air defense systems have been obliterated as of late April. This is not a sustainable operational loss. It is the terminal erosion of a superpower's protective dome. The crisis is compounding at a lethal velocity. As Kyiv deploys increasingly sophisticated mid-range loitering munitions, Russian air defenses stationed directly within occupied territories are being systematically hunted. Hundreds of targeted strikes over the past year have been dedicated exclusively to blinding and destroying Russian anti-aircraft infrastructure. Many of these multi-million-dollar interceptor batteries were ironically vaporized by the very low-cost, autonomous drones they were engineered to destroy. The strategic reserve is entirely empty. Moscow is now devoid of surplus systems waiting in deep storage. This deficit forces the Russian General Staff into a paralyzed, zero-sum strategic nightmare. To protect the vital oil terminals in Tuapse or the refineries in Samara, the Ministry of Defense must physically uproot active air defense networks from somewhere else. Every single radar array and missile tube repositioned to guard a civilian energy complex is a shield permanently stripped from an active combat zone. If Putin chooses to protect his geo-economic lifeline, he must knowingly expose his mechanized battalions and forward operating bases in occupied Ukraine to unopposed aerial annihilation. Conversely, if he prioritizes the front line, the domestic energy sector, the sole financial engine of his regime, will simply burn to the ground. There is no third option. This is the agonizing reality of asymmetrical warfare executed with ruthless precision. Kyiv has masterfully engineered a scenario where Russia is forced to cannibalize its own military architecture. The air defense umbrella is being stretched so thin across 11 time zones that it is structurally tearing apart. And as the Kremlin frantically shuffles its remaining battered missile systems across thousands of miles of vulnerable railways to plug the gaps, a secondary, far deadlier consequence is materializing. The systematic dismantling of these energy nodes is no longer just an economic crisis. It is actively suffocating the very soldiers Russia is attempting to protect. The abstraction of macroeconomic collapse ultimately crystallizes in the mud of the front line. While the Kremlin frantically attempts to reshuffle its exhausted air defenses to shield domestic energy nodes, the downstream effects of this severed supply chain are actively strangling the occupying forces inside Ukraine. The world once viewed the Russian army as an inexhaustible juggernaut, a force that could absorb infinite punishment and simply outmass its adversaries. The brutal reality currently unfolding across the theater of war proves the exact opposite. A juggernaut requires momentum, and momentum is entirely dictated by the physical availability of refined fuel. Russian military doctrine is predicated on continuous mechanized assaults. Armored spearheads and relentless artillery barrages require an unbroken river of diesel and specialized military-grade lubricants. When that river evaporates, the grand illusion of Russian ground supremacy shatters. The machinery simply stops. This is where the cold brilliance of the Ukrainian operational design becomes undeniable. Kyiv is executing a synchronized, dual-layered siege. While the long-range autonomous swarms obliterate the primary refining sources deep inside the Russian Federation, a parallel campaign of mid-range drones is systematically hunting down the forward storage hubs. In the heavily fortified sectors of Mariupol, Mangush, Grafska, and the Tokmak district, the localized lifeblood of the Russian Southern Command has been systematically incinerated. Critical lubricant reserves and vehicle repair units, the very infrastructure required to keep aging Soviet armor operational, have been targeted with ruthless precision. Without these localized reserves, the mechanical failures compound at a terminal velocity. An armored battalion deprived of diesel is no longer a fighting force. It is a collection of static, multi-million-dollar steel coffins. Heavy artillery pieces warp and seize without proper maintenance fluids. Mechanized recovery units cannot operate to retrieve damaged vehicles, leaving them to be picked off by cheap explosive drones. The entire push logistics system that Russia so desperately relies upon begins to cannibalize itself. The Russian infantry is stripped of its armored mobility, effectively frozen in place across a hostile, closely watched landscape. Recognizing this creeping frontline paralysis, Russian logistical commanders attempted a desperate strategic pivot. They sought to bypass the shattered overland routes and burning northern facilities by aggressively rerouting massive volumes of emergency fuel through alternative southern maritime arteries. The Tuapse oil port on the Black Sea coast was designated as the critical conduit to resupply the starving southern front. It was intended to be the logistical lifeline that would restart the stalling engines of the occupation. Kyiv did not merely observe this frantic rerouting. They anticipated it with chilling precision. On April 20th, just as the redirected shipments were poised to alleviate the severe fuel deficit on the battlefield, the Ukrainian strike forces descended on Tuapse for the second time in a week. They did not just damage the port's architecture, they vaporized the Kremlin's emergency reserve in a catastrophic secondary fireball. The alternative artery was severed before the fuel could ever reach the trenches. The occupying forces are now trapped in a rapidly tightening strategic cage. Their commanders are forced to watch as their overwhelming mechanized advantage slowly asphyxiates. The gears of the invasion are seizing up, and as the front line grinds to an agonizing halt, Moscow is forced to confront a final, terrifying calculation. We are witnessing the final, undeniable obsolescence of a geopolitical titan. The era where sprawling geographic depth and subterranean wealth guaranteed national security has abruptly ended. The global order is watching the foundational myth of Russian deterrence disintegrate in real time. Russia built its modern identity and its entire military doctrine on the premise of being an untouchable fortress fueled by an infinite reservoir of crude energy. That fortress has been systematically hollowed out from the inside. What began as an isolated series of cross-border skirmishes has mutated into a permanent structural dismantling of the Russian petro-state. Kyiv has engineered a masterclass in asymmetrical geoeconomic warfare, ruthlessly bypassing diplomatic gridlock and Western hesitation to strike directly at the central nervous system of the occupation. By trading cheap, autonomous silicon for multi-billion-dollar refineries and irreplaceable air defense arrays, Ukraine has trapped the Kremlin in an unwinnable equation. Moscow can no longer protect its economic core without sacrificing its frontline forces, and it cannot supply its frontline forces without condemning its domestic economy to the flames. This is not a temporary logistical disruption or a recoverable setback. It is a terminal condition. As the fires at Tuapse, Syzran, and the Baltic ports continue to smolder, they illuminate a terrifying new paradigm for the Russian General Staff. The massive mechanized army that crossed the border is slowly suffocating, completely paralyzed by the precise, relentless amputation of its own vital supply lines. The conflict is no longer a traditional contest of territorial acquisition. It is a brutal, irreversible test of structural endurance. The Russian war machine is bleeding out, fundamentally incapable of adapting to the lethal reality of the skies. The inferno has been ignited. The only remaining variable is how long the collapsing architecture can endure before the entire system shatters beyond repair.